Have you ever had a moment that completely changed how you see the world? Where everything you thought you knew suddenly shifts? That happened to me last summer, and I'm finally ready to share it with you. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support means everything as I open up about one of the most vulnerable experiences of my life. I still remember the exact moment she walked into the coffee shop. Emma Chen, with her confident stride and that smile that seemed to light up the entire room. I'd spent 3 weeks working up the courage to ask her out after we'd met at my friend's gallery opening. When she said yes, I couldn't believe my luck. But I had no idea what was really happening, or how that date would change everything. The morning of our date, I spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear. I settled on a blue button-down that my sister once said brought out my eyes. I arrived 20 minutes early, claimed a table by the window, and pretended to read a book while actually watching the door. My palms were sweating. I hadn't been this nervous for a date in years. When Emma walked in, she looked even more beautiful than I remembered. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands framing her face. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans, but somehow made it look effortlessly elegant. I stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over my chair, and waved awkwardly. She smiled, that same warm smile that had caught my attention at the gallery, and made her way over. "Hi, Daniel," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "Sorry if I'm a little late." "Not at all," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I just got here myself." A lie, but a harmless one, I thought. The conversation flowed easily at first. We talked about our jobs. She was a graphic designer for a non-profit, I worked in architectural restoration. We discovered a shared love of old films and Thai food. She laughed at my terrible jokes, and I found myself leaning in, captivated by the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. But then I noticed something. A slight hesitation in her responses. The way her eyes would occasionally dart to the door, or how she'd check her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. There was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there when she first sat down. "Is everything okay?" I finally asked after she checked her watch for the 3rd time. Emma looked up, startled. For a moment, I saw something like guilt flash across her face. Then she took a deep breath. "Daniel, I need to be honest with you," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "I didn't come here just for a date." My stomach dropped. Was she already seeing someone? Was this some kind of prank? A million possibilities raced through my mind, none of them good. "The truth is," she continued, "I recognized your name when you introduced yourself at the gallery. You worked on the Westfield building restoration last year, right?" I nodded slowly, confused about where this was going. My grandmother's apartment was in that building. She lived there for 47 years before the renovation forced all the residents out. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. The Westfield project had been controversial, an historic apartment building converted into luxury condos. I'd been proud of the restoration work, preserving the original facade and architectural details, but I knew many long-term residents had been displaced. "She died 3 months after moving," Emma said quietly. "The doctors said it was heart failure, but I know it was heartbreak. That building was her home." I sat there, stunned into silence. The beautiful woman across from me hadn't come because she was interested in me. She'd come to confront the person who had played a part, however small, in her grandmother's final heartbreak. "I just wanted to see the face of someone involved," she continued. "To make you understand what these revitalization projects really cost. I was going to tell you off and leave, but then." "Then what?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Emma looked down at her hands. "Then you started talking about your work with such passion. About preserving history and community. You seemed to genuinely care, and it confused me. You didn't fit the heartless developer image I'd created in my mind." The silence between us felt heavy with unspoken grief and guilt. I thought about my role in the project, how I'd focused on the technical challenges of preservation without considering the human cost. I'd never met the residents, never heard their stories. They were abstractions, not real people with lives and memories tied to those walls. "I'm so sorry about your grandmother," I finally said. "I never thought about the people who had to leave." That's no excuse, but it's the truth." Emma nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. Her name was Maylin. She came to this country in 1972 with nothing but a suitcase and determination. That apartment was the first place that ever felt like home to her in America. As Emma spoke about her grandmother, something shifted between us. What had begun as confrontation slowly transformed into connection. She showed me photos on her phone, Maylin standing proudly on her small balcony, surrounded by potted plants, Maylin teaching a young Emma to make dumplings in the tiny kitchen, Maylin's 80th birthday celebration in the building's community room. She kept every letter from the management company, Emma said. From the first notice about potential renovation to the final eviction letter. She read them over and over, trying to understand how they could take her home away. My chest felt tight. I had been so focused on preserving the building's physical features that I'd never considered we were erasing its soul, the community and lives that had given it meaning. "What happened to the other residents?" I asked. "Scattered," Emma replied. "Some found places nearby, but most had to move far away. The neighborhood became unaffordable overnight. 40 years of community, just gone. We stayed in that coffee shop for hours, long after our drinks went cold." Emma told me about growing up visiting her grandmother, about the neighbors who had watched out for each other, about the small businesses that had closed when their customers were displaced. As the afternoon light began to fade, I made a decision. "I want to do something," I said. "I can't undo what happened to your grandmother or the others, but maybe I can help make sure it doesn't happen again." Emma looked skeptical. "What could you possibly do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I have connections in the industry. I understand the technical side of restoration and preservation. Maybe I could work with community organizations, help residents fight back against predatory development." "You'd do that?" she asked, studying my face carefully. "I want to try," I said. "Will you help me? You understand the human side of this in a way I never could." That coffee date marked the beginning of something neither of us could have anticipated. Not a romance, though that would come later, slowly and unexpectedly, but a partnership. Emma introduced me to former Westfield residents who shared their stories. I started attending community board meetings, using my expertise to help residents understand the technical aspects of proposed developments and identify potential violations. 6 months after our first meeting, we launched a small consulting firm, Community Preservation Partners. We worked with tenant associations and neighborhood groups, helping them navigate the complex world of urban development and historic preservation. We couldn't stop all displacement, but we could give communities tools to fight back and developers incentives to include existing residents in their plans. The work was challenging and often frustrating. For every victory, there were painful defeats. But there were moments that made it all worthwhile, like when we helped the residents of the Martinez building negotiate with developers to include affordable units specifically reserved for current tenants in the renovation plans. A year after our first meeting, Emma and I returned to the same coffee shop. We sat at the same table by the window, but everything else had changed. "I've been thinking about Maylin a lot lately," I said as we waited for our drinks. "I wish I could have met her." Emma smiled, that same warm smile that had first caught my attention, but now I understood the depth behind it. "She would have liked you, I think." "Not at first, she was stubborn like me. But eventually." "I hope so," I said. "I feel like I know her, from your stories." "That's the thing about stories," Emma replied. "They keep people alive in a way. As long as we remember them, share their experiences, they're still with us." That conversation sparked our next project, a digital archive of resident stories from buildings undergoing redevelopment. We recorded interviews, collected photographs, documented the lives that had filled those spaces. It wouldn't stop the changes sweeping through the city, but it ensured that the communities wouldn't be forgotten, that their stories would be preserved alongside the architectural features. 2 years after our first meeting, Emma and I stood in front of the Westfield building. The restored facade gleamed in the sunlight, the original details meticulously preserved. It looked beautiful, but we both knew what had been lost. "I have something to show you," Emma said, taking my hand and leading me around the corner to a small park adjacent to the building. There, nestled among the new landscaping, was a simple stone bench with a plaque, "In memory of Mei Lin Chen and the Westfield Community, 1972 to 2019. A home is more than walls and windows." "How did you?" I began, touching the cool metal of the plaque. "The developer agreed to it after our campaign," Emma explained. "It's small, but it's something. A reminder that people lived here, loved here." I looked at Emma, this remarkable woman who had turned her grief into purpose, her anger into action. Who had come to our first meeting seeking confrontation but had found collaboration instead. Who had taught me to see beyond blueprints and preservation guidelines to the human lives affected by my work. "Thank you," I said simply. "For what?" "For saying yes to that date. For telling me the truth. For changing how I see everything." Emma squeezed my hand. "We're just getting started." And we were. The work continued, sometimes discouraging, often rewarding. We couldn't save every building or prevent every displacement, but we could ensure that development happened with respect for existing communities, that progress didn't come at the cost of erasing history and lives. What began as a confrontation in a coffee shop had become a mission, a partnership, and eventually, a love story. Not the one either of us had expected, but perhaps the one we both needed. I often think about how easily our paths might never have crossed. If Emma had simply held on to her anger instead of confronting me. If I had responded defensively instead of listening. If either of us had walked away from that difficult first conversation. Sometimes the most important connections in our lives begin with discomfort, with having our assumptions challenged, with being forced to see the world through someone else's eyes. Emma came to that coffee shop to make me understand the human cost of my work. She succeeded beyond anything either of us could have imagined. 3 years after our first meeting, I asked Emma another question over coffee. This time, when she said yes, we both knew exactly why she was there. Life rarely follows the path we expect. Sometimes a coffee date that begins with confrontation ends with transformation. Sometimes the people who challenge us most are the ones who help us become who we're meant to be. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that behind every building, every neighborhood, every city block, there are stories, lives lived, communities formed, memories made. And those stories matter just as much as the structures that house them. Thank you for listening to mine. If this resonated with you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'll be sharing more stories about community, preservation, and finding purpose in unexpected places. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones we almost don't hear, the ones that change everything when we finally listen. As our work expanded, Emma and I found ourselves becoming advocates not just for buildings, but for the concept of home itself. We started a podcast called More Than Walls, where we interviewed residents facing displacement, urban planners with innovative ideas, and developers willing to try new approaches. The stories we collected became a powerful tool for change. 5 years after that first coffee date, we stood before the City Council, presenting our most ambitious proposal yet, a comprehensive policy framework that would require meaningful community involvement in any major development project. The room was packed with people we'd met through our work, elderly residents fighting to stay in their homes, young activists passionate about affordable housing, small business owners trying to preserve neighborhood character. The question isn't whether our cities will change, I told the council members. Change is inevitable. The question is whether that change will erase existing communities or include them. Emma stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. Behind me are people from every neighborhood in this city. They're not against development or restoration. They're against being treated as obstacles rather than stakeholders. They're against having their stories and lives considered less valuable than property values. The vote was close, but the framework passed. It wasn't perfect, compromise rarely is, but it was a start. Developers would now be required to document the social and cultural history of buildings before renovation, to include affordable housing options for existing residents, and to preserve spaces for community use. That night, as we celebrated with our coalition of unlikely allies, Emma pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about Maylin again," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She always told me that anger can start a journey, but it can't sustain one. You need to find something to build, not just something to fight against." She was wise, I replied, holding Emma's hand. "She would be proud of this," Emma said, gesturing to the diverse group of people around us, united by a common purpose. "Not just the policy, but the community we've built along the way." 7 years after Emma walked into that coffee shop with confrontation on her mind, we stood in the community garden that had been established in what was once the Westfield Building's parking lot. The garden had become a living memorial to the former residents, each plot named after someone who had lived there, with plants chosen to reflect their cultural heritage. Maylin's plot was in the center, bursting with the Chinese vegetables and herbs she had once grown on her small balcony. Emma knelt beside it, carefully weeding around the tender shoots. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just yelled at you and left that day," she said, looking up at me with a smile that still made my heart skip. "If I'd just vented my anger and walked away." "I'm glad you stayed," I said simply. "Me too," she replied, standing and brushing the soil from her hands. "Though I never expected this is where we'd end up." Our daughter, Lynn, named for her great-grandmother, toddled over from where she'd been examining a caterpillar on a nearby leaf. At 3 years old, she already understood that gardens and communities needed constant care and attention. She'd grown up attending community meetings and construction site visits, falling asleep to the sound of residents sharing their stories for our archive. "Flower for Nai," she announced proudly, holding up a slightly crushed marigold. Emma took it gently and placed it on the small stone marker at the edge of the plot. "Perfect, sweetheart. Nai would love it." As I watched my family in this garden that symbolized everything we'd worked for, I thought about how profoundly that coffee date had altered the course of my life. How Emma's courage in confronting me had opened my eyes to a dimension of my work I'd never considered. How what began as an uncomfortable conversation had blossomed into purpose, partnership, and love. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the garden. Other families were gathering, former Westfield residents and newcomers alike, for the monthly community dinner. Tables were being set up, dishes passed around, children running between the garden plots in an impromptu game of tag. "Ready?" Emma asked, lifting Lynn onto her hip. I nodded, taking one last look around. This living, breathing community, was what preservation really meant. Not just saving buildings, but nurturing the connections between people and places, honoring the past while creating space for new stories to unfold. As we joined the gathering, I was struck by how something so beautiful had emerged from what could have been just another failed date. How Emma's decision to speak her truth and my choice to listen had set in motion a chain of events neither of us could have predicted. Life rarely gives us clear signposts for the paths we should take. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys begin with discomfort, with having our assumptions challenged, with being brave enough to stay in difficult conversations. Emma came to that coffee shop to make me understand the human cost of my work. In doing so, she gave me the greatest gift, a new way of seeing, a new purpose, a new definition of home. 10 years after that first meeting, as I watch Emma laughing with former Westfield residents while Lynn helps serve dessert, I'm filled with gratitude for the confrontation that became collaboration, for the anger that transformed into action, for the date that changed everything. Because sometimes, the most important connections in our lives begin with the courage to say what needs to be said, and the wisdom to truly listen when someone does. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. Perhaps there's someone in your life who challenged you, who made you see the world differently, who helped you become more than you were. If so, I hope you'll take a moment to thank them. And if you found value in this journey we've shared, please subscribe to hear more stories about finding purpose in unexpected places and building community in a world that often seems determined to pull us apart. Because in the end, we're all just looking for a place to belong, a home that's more than walls and windows. Sometimes we find it in the most unexpected ways, with the most unexpected people. And sometimes, like Emma and me, we build it together, one difficult conversation at a time.